Beneath the shadow of the northern firs, where pine needles softened each step and wood smoke curled like incense into the pale morning sky, a hamlet rested at the edge of the great forest. It seemed untouched by the fires of war that raged beyond the horizon, though the faint scars of the wider world lingered here as in all places. At its heart stood a modest chapel, whitewashed and weather-worn, its single bell reserved for Sabbath and morning. The old priest within had walked among his people for decades. His patched robes carried the scent of cedar and candle wax. His voice, though lined with age, had the warm timbre of settling oak. He tended a garden, hoed furrows in the soil, and offered blessings over seedlings and harvests alike. He kept no luxuries, slept on straw, and returned tithes as bread, fish, or firewood. He lent his hammer to mend roofs, carried salves to the sick, and buried the dead with the care one might give a saint's remains. The people trusted him as one might trust the turning of the seasons. His greatest joy was the chapel school. Each morning, as parents left for field and forge, children filed in. He greeted each by name, guided them through letters and psalms, and told simple tales of virtue, stories whose exact details faded but whose lessons endured. Sometimes he would pause mid-lesson, watching dust motes drift through shafts of light over bright faces, and feel closer to God than in any sermon. Refugees had once passed through with tales of plague and fire. Years before, raiders struck a neighboring village, prompting him to bless their old hunting rifles and form watches. No news had come from the church in years, yet still he prayed, morning and night, for the children's futures, for safe harvests, for mercy. One frosted morning, as he welcomed the children, a strange wind threaded through the trees. For an instant, he felt watched, not by heaven, but by something older, hungrier. He pushed the thought aside and opened the chapel doors. The day's lesson began with quiet invocation and the scratch of chalk. Then came the sound, a low, distant thunder rolling through the valley. It was uneven, muffled, yet unmistakable. The children froze mid-sentence. Another rumble followed, closer. "Pay it no mind," the priest said, calm but firm. "Storms pass." Yet the sky was clear. The sound came from beyond the hills, where armies of the faithful clashed with the hosts of hell. To distract them, he spoke with deliberate brightness, retelling a familiar tale of endurance and providence. He paced between pews, resting a hand on shoulders, drawing wandering eyes back to their work. A sudden, sharper boom rattled the windows. Some children flinched. One began to cry. He led them in a soft hymn until the sound of artillery was swallowed by their voices. When the hymn ended, movement beyond the windows caught his eye. A long column wound its way along the ridge, trucks and wagons, some chugging under their own engines, others pulled by oxen, all heavy with the wounded. Field medics clambered in and out, tending to pale, bloodied figures. Chaplains walked alongside, murmuring blessings over those barely conscious. The sigils of the faithful marked each vehicle, smeared with grime and crimson. He stepped outside into the cold air. The smell of exhaust, blood, and wet earth reached him on the wind. Wheels splashed through ruts filled with meltwater. A soldier at the rear caught his eye, nodded once. The priest raised 2 fingers in blessing. No words passed between them. The soldier moved on. He lingered until the last wagon creaked by, then returned inside. The children looked at him expectantly. He smiled faintly, as though nothing had changed, and resumed the lesson. But the thunder no longer felt far away. The thunder did not fade with the days. Instead, It became a constant tremor in the bones of the valley. Even when the sky was bright and the air still, the faint, percussive beat of distant artillery rolled through the hills. The distant battles never came close enough to see, yet their shadow lay heavy over the land. Seasons turned, and with them the earth itself seemed to tire. Winters grew longer, their snows deep and unyielding. The storms that came howled with a violence the villagers could not recall, tearing at thatch and uprooting saplings. Spring's thaw brought no renewal, only sodden fields where shoots rose pale and brittle. The forest at the hamlet's edge began to lose its vigour. Needles browned and dropped early. The bark of the great firs split in strange patterns, as if the life within were retreating. Birds sang less, their calls thin and uncertain. The soil, once rich and dark, grew pale and coarse under the farmers' hands. When they tilled, they found more stone than seedbed. The villagers knew the language of the earth, could read its moods in the curl of a leaf or the weight of a cloud. Now the signs spoke of want. Every furrow they turned whispered the same grim truth. The harvest would be meagre. The weight of this knowledge pressed on them. Faces grew drawn, and conversations by the well were quieter. In the fields, farmers worked with a weary determination, as though labour might coax life back into the soil. Yet despair clung to them like a damp fog. In the midst of this, the old priest worked harder than ever. He moved among the villagers, offering blessings at the furrows, speaking words of endurance. He told them the trials of the faithful were never without purpose, that they must keep to prayer when their hearts were heavy. To the children, he gave lessons wrapped in laughter, striving to keep their eyes bright even as the skies seemed to darken. In private, he wrote letters, first to the church, then to neighbouring villages. He spoke of the land's decline, of the strange storms, of the unending thunder. The church never replied. The few answers from other villages were grim mirrors of his own story, failing crops, sickened livestock, and a creeping malaise that no blessing could lift. Each unanswered letter left a deeper crease in his brow, yet he said nothing of it to his flock. To them he remained steady, a figure of hope against the slow unravelling of the land. But in the quiet hours, alone in the chapel with the candle's thin flame, he wondered if heaven still heard them at all. It was well past midnight when the sound of the hooves broke the stillness. The old priest, awake at his desk, paused mid-sentence in another unanswered letter to the church. Outside, the wind carried the laboured snort of a horse, the scrape of hooves on frozen earth. He stepped to the chapel door and unlatched it. A lone rider slumped in the saddle, his face grey beneath a mask of dirt. His cloak was stiff with frost, his lips cracked. When the villagers roused and came with lanterns, they found the man barely able to dismount. Someone offered water. He drank greedily, spilling half of it down his chest. Between gasps, he said only, "For the priest," and held out a weather-stained envelope. The old priest took it with a strange dread. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Broad, deliberate strokes he had seen on dozens of letters over the years. It belonged to a friend, a fellow shepherd of souls who had tended a parish on the far side of the forest, far nearer to the front lines. They had shared counsel and solace for most of their long lives. He broke the seal by lantern light. The words within were steeped in exhaustion, edged with despair. His friend, once a pillar of unshakable faith, now wrote of hardship with a tone that betrayed a faltering heart. The church's soldiers had arrived in his village and requisitioned nearly all their remaining food stores. He framed it as obedience to God's will, a necessary sacrifice for the greater struggle, but the priest could read between the lines. The village was left with too little to last the winter. He felt the weight of it settle in his chest. Here, his own people would barely make it through to spring on what little they had harvested. If the season ahead was as harsh as the last, they would be tightening belts until they cut into bone. He could not spare a single sack of grain without endangering them all, and so he knew, even before finishing the letter, that his friend's flock would likely not survive the winter. When he told the elders, they listened in grim silence. One muttered about the cruelty of the church's demands. Another spat into the dirt. Anger simmered beneath their weariness. The priest raised his hands and spoke of duty, of the worthiness of such sacrifices in the eyes of God, of how those at the front must be fed if the war was to be won. But even as the words left his mouth, they rang hollow to his own ears. The elders said little in reply, but their eyes told him they knew what he did, that the end for their neighbors was already written. When they dispersed, the night seemed colder. Alone, the priest lingered by the chapel's altar, the letter clutched in his hand, the ink smudging under his thumb. He prayed for his friend, for the starving villagers across the forest, for the soldiers who had taken what they could not afford to give. But the silence that followed his prayer was deep and heavy, as though no ear in heaven had heard him at all. By morning, the rider was recovering in a spare cot by the chapel hearth, wrapped in thick blankets and sipping water between shallow breaths. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke at length, and what he said deepened the unease in the village. His was not the only settlement visited by the church's soldiers. They had been moving through the region for weeks, he said, gathering what they needed in the name of the war effort. It was only a matter of time before they came here. A murmur of alarm spread through the villagers gathered to hear him. Some voices rose in protest, others in fear. The old priest stepped forward, raising his hands for silence. He spoke of trust, of patience, of faith that God's servants would not take more than they must. He urged them to keep their hearts steady, especially before the eyes of the children who lingered at the edges of the crowd, wide-eyed and listening. That night, unable to quiet his mind, the priest walked the village paths beneath a cold moon. Frost crunched beneath his boots as he passed shuttered windows and the faint glow of dying hearths. His breath hung in the air, ghostly in the stillness. As he neared the forest's edge, he caught the flicker of lamplight through the trees. Curiosity led him closer, his steps muffled by the undergrowth. There, half hidden among the bare trunks, a small group of villagers worked in the shadows. They were digging, their breath steaming in the cold, shovels biting into frozen soil. Beside them lay sacks, grain, roots, dried herbs, most of a season's harvest. He stayed hidden, watching. The truth came to him with a slow, heavy certainty. They were burying the food, hiding it from the church's soldiers. The act was quiet, urgent, born not of greed but of fear. His heart twisted. By the letter of the law, this was theft from God's cause, a sin. But as his eyes lingered on the weary shapes of the men and women, he thought of the children in the chapel, their small hands gripping chalk, their laughter echoing in the rafters. He imagined those faces hollow with hunger, and the thought rooted him to the spot. The shovel blades bit into the ground again and again, until the last sack was covered. Without a word, the villagers took up their tools and vanished into the night. The priest remained in the shadows for a long while, his breath uneven. He knew he should have stepped forward, should have spoken against their act, but his voice had failed him before he'd even tried. When he finally turned back toward the chapel, he felt the weight of his silence settle upon him. In his chambers, he knelt at the small altar. His whispered prayer was for forgiveness, both for the heresy of his flock and for his own weakness in letting it pass. The candle's flame wavered as though in answer, but no warmth came from it, only a thin, cold light. The rider's warning proved true only days later. From the high road came the low rumble of engines, growing louder until the first truck rolled into view. It was followed by others, their beds heaped with sacks and crates taken from other villages. The soldiers in the convoy looked worn thin, faces hollow, eyes shadowed, the gaunt expressions of men who had been too long at war. Their uniforms were patched, their rifles and webbing scuffed from years of hard use. At their head came an officer whose gear was markedly better kept. His coat was clean, his boots polished, his sidearm holster oiled. He carried himself with the slow precision of a man who had learned to mask fatigue. Yet the lines at his eyes told of sleepless nights. The officer approached the priest first, offering a curt bow and a few polite words of respect. Then he moved on to the elders gathered near the chapel steps. His voice was steady, but without warmth, as he stated his purpose. He had come to collect supplies for the front. The elders spoke in turn, telling him of the failing crops, the harsh winter, the storms that had blighted their fields. They explained there was nothing to give, their own stores too thin to see them through to spring. The officer listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was no overt accusation in his gaze, but neither was there belief. At last, he asked to see the stores himself. Reluctantly, the elders led him to the granary. The doors were thrown open to reveal a nearly emptied interior, just a few sacks of grain, barrels of salted root, and some withered vegetables. The officer stood in the doorway for a long time, his breath curling in the cold air. When he turned back to them, the weariness in his face seemed deeper, his eyes softer. But mercy did not follow. "To the trucks," he ordered quietly. The words struck the villagers like a blow. Cries of protest rose up, pleas, curses, sobs. The soldiers moved without reaction, stepping past them into the granary. They took what little remained, their movements efficient, faces fixed in the blank mask of men long numb to suffering. If they heard the cries, they gave no sign. The priest stood apart, his hands clasped, feeling the burn of shame in his chest. His silence when the villagers had buried their stores now felt like a wound. He had failed in truth and in faith, and yet, as the soldiers carried the last sacks away, another feeling eclipsed his shame. It was anger. Anger at the men who were meant to be protectors. Anger at those who could look into the eyes of the children and still take the bread from their mouths. Anger that the work of God's own hand could be twisted into such cruelty. When the last truck was loaded, the officer lingered a moment longer. His gaze swept the village as though memorizing its faces. Then, in a voice stripped of all but duty, he said, "Better to die of hunger than at the hands of the followers of hell." The engines roared to life, and the convoy rolled away, leaving only churned mud and the echo of the officer's words. The priest watched them vanish into the distance, the cold tightening in his chest. He did not pray that night. Within days of the convoy's departure, winter struck like a hammer. The ground froze solid, ice sheathing every path and branch. Blizzards became a daily trial, driving snow in thick, blinding sheets that scoured the skin and stripped warmth from the bones. The wind howled against doors and shutters, a constant reminder of how small the village was against the season's fury. Each night, small groups of villagers slipped into the woods with shovels and baskets. They returned, carrying the hidden stores they had buried weeks before, always glancing nervously in the direction the convoy had gone, as though soldiers might appear from the storm at any moment. Their movements were quiet and swift, the work of people who knew discovery would mean ruin. On more than one occasion, a villager came to the priest's door, a bundle of food in hand and guilt in their eyes. They offered little explanation, but he understood well enough. He eased their shame with gentle words, telling them that a parent's first duty was to their children. He accepted the small offerings with gratitude, knowing they were given at cost. He continued to preach on the Sabbath, his voice steady and warm, but he could feel the change in the room. The adults no longer nodded with the same fervor, no longer smiled at reminders of God's providence. Bitterness had crept in, curling like frost around their hearts. When the church was mentioned, quiet grumbling followed, muttered words laced with anger. He would pause, intending to answer, but found himself without the strength to rebuke them. A week into that brutal winter, a figure stumbled out of the woods as dusk fell. She was a woman, thin as a shadow, her cheeks hollow, her skin pale and cracked from windburn. In her arms she clutched a swaddled infant, holding it close to her chest as though shielding it from death itself. The villagers rushed to her aid, guiding her inside and wrapping her in blankets, pressing warm broth to her lips. But it was too late. The frost had claimed too much. Her breaths were shallow, her eyes already clouding. Between coughs, she told her story in broken words. The church's soldiers had come to her village, as they had to so many others, taking what little food they had gathered. There had been no chance to endure the winter. Desperation had driven some to leave, hoping to reach other villages, but the snows came sooner and harsher than any could remember. She had been the only one to make it this far. Her final words were for the child. She begged them, pleaded through cracked lips, to care for the baby. Then she exhaled a final trembling breath and went still. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then curses spilled from the villagers' lips, spat on the floor, whispered with venom, flung like stones against the absent church. The priest stood among them, the child now in his arms, and found no words to give in answer. The familiar responses, the pious corrections, the assurances of God's plan would not come. All he could feel was the weight of the infant and the cold truth that he no longer had the strength to defend those who had caused this. The infant remained in the priest's arms long after the woman's body had been taken away for burial. He carried the child into his modest quarters, wrapped it in the warmest blankets he could find, and set about preparing milk warmed over the hearth. In those first days, he cared for the child with the same grandfatherly affection he had given to generations of the village's young. He spoke softly to it, rocked it in the crook of his arm, and whispered lullabies he had once sung in the chapel school. It quickly became apparent that the scars of the child's loss were deep. Even with its mind barely formed, the infant would break into fitful wails at the sight of a cross. The first time it happened, the priest had been standing before the altar with the baby cradled against him. The child's cries came sharp and terrified, and only when he turned away, shielding the crucifix from view, did it begin to calm. The second time, and the third, left no doubt. The infant's tiny body trembled whenever its eyes fell upon the holy symbol. It pained him to see such distress. At last, he began quietly stowing away the cross that hung in his living space. It felt dangerously close to blasphemy, but his love for the child outweighed his fear of impropriety. He told himself it was mercy, a concession to trauma. Days passed, and he realized that the absence of the icon did not trouble him as it once might have. His daily prayers continued, but the familiar words did not come as easily. He found himself hesitating, pausing mid-verse, his mind wandering into silences that felt heavy and unlit. For most of his long life, doubt had never shadowed his faith. He had been so certain of the holiness of the Lord that there was no room for uncertainty. He had seen God's love in the bright smiles of children learning their letters, in the laughter echoing from the chapel walls, in the first shoots of green after a long winter. Now those certainties faltered. The whispers of doubt began to seep into his mind like water through stone. Each night at prayer, he found himself begging, not merely reciting, but pleading for clarity. He asked why the innocent were made to suffer, why the villagers starved while others took from their mouths, why the hardships were never relieved. He begged for a sign, for any proof that the trials they endured were in service to a just and holy cause. He begged to understand what end their pain was meant to serve. Yet the silence after each prayer stretched longer, until it seemed like no voice in heaven answered him at all. Still, he rose each morning to feed the child, to tend to the sick, to speak kindly to his neighbors. Outwardly, he was the same old priest they had always known, but within, something had begun to shift, small, quiet, and dangerous. A seed of doubt had taken root, and with each unanswered prayer, it grew. As winter's grip deepened, the priest began to see changes in his flock, changes that troubled him more than the bitter cold or dwindling stores. The villagers, once quick with a warm word or a shared loaf, grew quiet and guarded. Conversations that had once carried easily over the snowy lanes now took place in hushed tones, glances darting to ensure no one else could overhear. A hardness had settled in their eyes, replacing the open kindness that had long been their hallmark. Faces that had once lit up in greeting now remained unreadable, closed off behind the weathered masks of survival. Even the children sensed it. Their laughter came less often, and they played closer to home. The change extended to the way they viewed the world beyond their borders. Every sound from the woods, every crack of a branch or distant movement, was met with sharp, suspicious looks. The forest, once their ally in providing firewood and game, had become a looming wall behind which they imagined only threats, soldiers, bandits, or worse. Worship, too, withered in the cold. The chapel stood mostly empty on the Sabbath. Those who did attend came without reverence, their eyes downcast, their responses to the liturgy murmured without conviction. The church, in their eyes, had become just another danger, an authority that might strip them of the little they still had. The rituals that had once been a source of hope now seemed a reminder of those who had taken from them. The priest continued his duties, but he felt the shift like ice beneath his feet. Each sermon was met with polite silence rather than the nods and murmurs of agreement he had once known. Scripture, once a balm to their hearts, now seemed to pass through them like wind through bare branches. He could not deny the truth. The faith of his people was crumbling, ground down by hunger, fear, and betrayal. And though he longed to rekindle it, he no longer knew if his own flame burned brightly enough to guide them back. In the weeks that followed, his counsel changed, though few remarked on the change aloud. He still stood before them on the Sabbath, still visited thresholds with a kettle and a blessing, still bent his back beside theirs to shovel snow away from doors and sheds. But his words no longer reached for heaven as often as they once had. They reached, instead, for what could be held in a hand: dry firewood, clean water, a hot stone in a child's mitten. "Watch the chimneys," he told them. "Bank the coals at dusk and cover the hearths when the wind turns north. The draught will steal the heat like a thief." He spoke of larders and root cellars, of dividing what little they had into sealed jars, of rationing without shame. He organized nighttime watches not to spy upon neighbors, but to take turns listening for broken rafters under snow, for a goat in labor, for a widow's cough that might turn to fever. When voices grumbled about the church, he did not contradict them. Instead, he redirected. "Look to your own," he said. "Guard the young." The infant slept in a basket by his stove, bundled in wool and wrapped in a shawl a village girl had outgrown. When storms screamed against the eaves and drove needles of ice under the doors, he moved the basket closer to the warmth and hummed the same simple melody, tuneless and soft. Sleep did not spare him. In the hours when the village huddled behind shutter and snow, his mind opened onto scenes he had never sought and could not refuse. The first night they came, he woke before dawn with a taste of ash on his tongue and a memory of a sky made of glass, cracked into long, luminous veins that bled light onto a desert of soot. He stood before a palace the color of a fresh wound, all edges and impossible angles, and heard music like a swarm. When the doors opened, a court stepped forth, figures tall as bell towers, terrible and exquisite. Beauty meant a wound. Their garments were woven from wings and human hair. Their faces were painted with the calm of statues, but their eyes contained storms, and when they smiled, the air smelled of honey in graves. He knew deception when he saw it. He had taught children to recognize it, how the enemy gilded ruin, how hell made the shape of a virtue from the substance of a vice. He tried to spit at the dream, to cry out, but his voice in that place had no weight, like a hand pressed against a window pane from the wrong side. One of the lords of that court raised a goblet the size of a washtub and drank from it until the firelight dimmed. When it lowered the chalice, it regarded him not with hatred, but with pity. He woke with the infant's fingers clenched around his thumb, and a film of frost limning the inside of the window, as if breath alone could freeze the world. The next night the dream was a trench that never ended, its walls ribbed with timber and bone. Artillery stitched fire across the horizon in a steady rosary of light. He saw ranks in drab greatcoats moving through smoke as though through rain, heads bowed, rifles held at the port, boots finding each plank as if guided by prayer. Opposite them came the legions of hell, men and not men in lacquered masks, ox-tank cylinders hissing like serpents upon their backs, knives like ice floes jutting from their gauntlets. They fell upon each other without words. Mud closed over faces, and the earth took everything. Then the dream swerved. A vaulted chamber, white as a tooth. Lamplight so bright it made the shadows blue. Men and women lay strapped into iron cradles, while learned hands worked at them with calm efficiency. The tools gleamed. Prayers were recited. Some were sung. Flesh was opened, nerves were threaded with wire. Lungs were replaced with arcane machines that sighed in time with a metronome hung upon a cruciform frame. When those bodies rose, they rose taller, heavier, their skin laced with seams, their eyes shining like altar lamps. They knelt before a man in a cassock whose cuffs were spotless white. He smiled and blessed them and called them by new names. He woke shaking. He knew the enemy lied. He knew it bent memory and desire and fear until they aligned like sights on a rifle. And yet, it was the clarity that undid him. Dreams had their own logic. a slur to the edges where day and night bled together. These had none of that. They carried the specific weight of a thing seen, the smell of carbolic at the edge of sanctified iron, the tacky feel of drying blood on polished wood, the way a novice's hand trembled when passing a needle to a master. He had not imagined such details. He did not want to be able to imagine them at all. When he tried to pray, he found himself bargaining instead. If these visions are trials, remove them. If they are warnings, let me heed them. If they are deception, break their spell. Silence answered him, a silence dense as snow, swallowing sound and echo both. So he prayed differently. Keep the milk from souring. Send someone with a sack of coal to the widow on the east lane. Let the boy at the hedge line sleep through the watch without frostbite. His gospels had become bread and breath, and if he questioned the shift, he did it in the privacy of his own chest. The village followed suit without ever declaring it. A woman with raw hands boiled bones to make broth and left jars on thresholds without a name. 2 men mended the church roof during a break in the weather and said nothing about the cross missing from the priest's wall when they drank their tea to warm their fingers. Children learned to carry slivers of kindling in their pockets like talismans, passing them to friends with a conspirator's grin. And always the woods. The villagers kept their eyes on it. The priest kept his eyes on the villagers. He saw how they flinched when a fox cried at night. He saw how the older boys, who would have braved the drifts for sledding in gentler years, now hung back from the first stand of trees, as if a boundary had been set there none dared cross. When rumours came of a town upriver gone silent, of a bridge shelled into splinters, he did not share them. What good was fear that had no hands to carry water? Sometimes, during those long middles of night, when the infant nuzzled and fussed and would not be soothed, he spoke aloud to the babes of the past, as if they could hear him. You learned your letters on this bench, he told a memory. You dropped your slate and cried, and I told you it was nothing. He named their small illnesses and small triumphs, and in naming them, he held himself steady on the thin ledge between blasphemy and despair. But the visions did not relent. One brought the officer's face back to him, polished boots, clean coat, a gaze like a man peering over the edge of a deep well. Better to die of hunger, came again, as if that sentence had scribed itself upon the priest's inner walls. This time, in the dream, the man's breath steamed in the cold and turned to flies. They fanned out and settled over the loaves in the villagers' baskets until the bread moved like something living. The priest wanted to strike them away. Instead, he cupped his hands and blew. The flies lifted in a black cloud and formed a shape in the air that was almost a crown, and then dispersed. He woke with the infant quiet, eyes open, watching him solemnly. For a long time he did nothing but listen to the soft ticking of the stove and the faint, far percussion of guns. A drumbeat the winter had taught him to hear, even when no one else spoke of it. He rose, looked to the shelf where the cross lay wrapped in cloth, and did not take it down. He did not hate God. He did not know how. But he understood now that the line between the armies was not as clean as he had once told his pupils, and that people could be unmade and remade by hands called holy as surely as by those called damned. He wished to unknow it. Wishing did nothing. When he stepped out into the pre-dawn to check the sky, the storm had paused, a brief stillness like the held breath before a cry. The horizon burned with a low orange smear. For an instant he mistook it for the coming sun. Then he realized it lay west, where no true dawn rose. He stood with snow hissing under his boots and watched the far glow pulse in time with distant thunder. A town, perhaps, a depot, someone else's stores. "Show me," he whispered, the words whiter than steam in the cold. "If our hunger serves any good, if our suffering is seed and not waste, show me." Only the infant answered, coughing once in his room and settling back into sleep. In the chapel, he did not open the altar, did not light the big candle. He sat on the front pew and counted his breaths to 100 and back, and when the count slipped, he began again. The prayer he finally managed was not Latin nor even scripture. It was a sentence no longer than the tiny ribs beneath his palm in the night. Keep them through to morning. By habit, he reached for the old words after that. Abba, Kyrie, Sanctus. But they fell from his mouth like dry seeds onto stone. He gathered them anyway, set them in a small pile that felt like a memorial, and let the silence sit where the answer used to be. When, at last, sleep reclaimed him in the chair, the court was waiting, lit by braziers whose smoke smelled of sugared rot. A beautiful figure leaned toward him with a compassion so flawless it cut. "You could feed them," it said, without moving its lips. "You could keep them warm." He woke with a start, a hand already raised as if to ward, and found only the humble room, the stove's faint glow, and the soft shape of a child beneath a woolen shawl. The wind had found its voice again outside. So had the guns. He drew the shawl higher, the act holy in a way words no longer were, and whispered to the room as if it could carry his vow outward to every threshold he tended. "I will keep them breathing," he said, "whatever it costs." And the storm pressed its palm against the walls, and the walls held for that night. As the winter deepened, the villagers' meagre stores shrank with every passing day. The few root vegetables left were shriveled and bitter. The last sacks of grain were stretched into thin, watery porridge. Despite the priest's tireless efforts to encourage hope, an air of quiet hopelessness hung over the hamlet like frost that refused to melt. The priest nights offered no respite. In his dreams, the figure returned, always different in form, but undeniably the same presence. Sometimes it wore the finery of a nobleman, sometimes the austere robes of a scholar, sometimes armor etched with symbols he did not recognize. Yet the voice was constant, measured, confident, and with a strange warmth that made the words sink deep. The figure introduced himself simply as the Count. He spoke with familiarity, as though they were old acquaintances, and with a respect that unsettled the priest. "You have served faithfully," the Count would say, "longer than most, with more devotion than many who claim to share your calling, but you have been deceived." The priest protested, but the Count would only smile and tell him to look. The dream would shift, the ground falling away into a bird's-eye view of the land. Below, the forest lay green and vibrant. Then time raced forward. Seasons bled into one another. Leaves dulled, branches grew bare, and the soil turned grey and lifeless. The rivers shrank to stagnant trickles. All warmth, all vigour drained from the land until it was nothing but a hollow echo of itself. "Your God has abandoned this place," the Count's voice came, not with venom, but with a mournful certainty. "Tell me, would an omnipotent, omniscient being allow his faithful to starve, to wither, to fade into dust?" The vision shifted again, to the front lines. Trenches churned into mud by endless bombardments stretched to the horizon. The priest saw the soldiers of the church, their faces gaunt, their movements slow with exhaustion. They fought on, but it was plain to see they were losing. Even if the lines did not collapse, the winter would claim them soon enough. Another shift. Homes within the village, each one a portrait of quiet misery. Families huddled close to sputtering hearths, their cheeks hollow, their eyes dull with hunger. Mothers rationed crusts of bread among their children, their own stomachs empty. The priest recognized every face. The Count's voice returned, low and persuasive. It does not have to be this way. There are powers in this world that reward loyalty. Powers that do not turn their backs when it is inconvenient. Your people could eat. Your children could laugh again. The priest wanted to deny him, but the weight of what he had seen pressed down upon him. The Count stepped closer, his form blurring and reforming, the fine lines of his face shifting as though made of smoke. "Slaughter one of the last goats," he said. "Bring its body to the woods. Do this, and I will show you what can be gained." The priest woke with a taste of cold iron on his tongue, the echo of the Count's words still clear in his mind. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen roofs, and somewhere in the darkness, a goat bleated. The priest tried to shake the Count's command from his mind, but the words clung like frost to his thoughts. He fought the pull of temptation, clinging to the remnants of his faith. Yet the images of hollow-cheeked families and dying children gnawed at his resolve. It was a mother's trembling voice that finally broke him. She came to him one evening, eyes red from crying, hands shaking. She told him her daughter was fading, her strength failing with each passing hour. She feared the child would not survive the night. Something in the priest's heart gave way. That night, he summoned the elders and told them his plan. They were shocked, appalled at first, that he would waste one of their last goats. But when he spoke, they listened. He was their shepherd, and even in these hard days they still trusted him. A single goat, they reasoned, would not change their fate. Perhaps in some strange way, it might even help. The next morning, under a sky heavy with low grey clouds, the goat was slaughtered. Its warm blood steamed against the snow. The carcass was wrapped in burlap, and together they carried it beyond the village, deep into the still skeletal woods. There, without ceremony, they laid it down and returned in silence. The following day, a young man burst into the village square, breathless, snow clinging to his coat. He had seen a herd of deer, fat, healthy, and far too close to the village for this season. The men wasted no time. Rifles in hand, they raced into the trees, their shouts echoing in the cold. By nightfall, they returned dragging carcasses, more than the village had seen in months. The air filled with the sounds of butchery and the smell of fresh meat. Laughter returned to faces that had forgotten the shape of joy. The priest moved among the deer, laying his hands on their hides. They were well fed, their bodies thick with fat, far healthier than any wild creature should have been after such a brutal winter. He felt the Count's presence in that moment, not in voice, but in the certainty that this was no accident. The Count returned that night with a smile that knew too much. He wore the face of a courtier this time. High collar, thin gloves, a ring set with a stone the colour of clotted dusk. But the eyes were the same as ever. They found the priest in the architecture of the dream, as if they had been waiting for him all along. "You did well," the Count said, voice serene. Beneath it, something vibrated, a second tone that did not belong to any human throat, like a bow drawn slowly across a wire. "I keep my promises. I always have." The priest wanted to protest that he had made no bargain, that necessity was not consent, but the words would not form. The Count's gaze slid past him, and the world opened like a book. He was lifted into a cold, impossible height, and the hamlet unrolled beneath him. Roofs hunched under snow, the black seam of the forest, a trail of men dragging deer through white. Then the pages turned faster. He saw, as if in a series of lantern slides, cheeks pinking with food, smoke curling from chimneys that had gone cold, the steadying of hands that had begun to tremble. It was true then. The bounty had not been a mercy of weather or chance. It had been given. More can come, the Count said gently. Winter can be made to loosen its fist, but gifts deserve devotion. The second voice thickened, something like the hum of flies, like choir notes sung under the floorboards. You have served long, serve rightly now. He woke before dawn with that thrumming still in his bones. The infant slept, breath soft and even. Outside, the storm had gentled to a sift of dry snow. He held the child a little longer than usual, as if the warmth of that small body could recall him fully to the ground. The days that followed moved in a pattern of task and recompense so consistent it began to feel like liturgy. In one dream, the Count, robed as a scholar, asked that a bowl of the first meal be set each night at the woodline. Broth from bone and scrap the village would not miss. The request was small. The next morning, rabbit prints stitched the drifts not 20 paces from the chapel, and by evening 3 snares hung heavy. In another dream, the Count, wrapped in a cloak lined with fur, spoke softly of bells. Do not ring them for a week. Let the winter hear only your work. The village kept Sabbath in silence, and for 7 days no roof beam cracked under the weight of snow. He told no one of the dreams. He did not need to. The elders were old enough to read the shape of a thing without seeing the hand that made it. They kept their concern in their teeth, and their anger at the church tamped it down like a stopper. When counterfeit providence began to look like simple survival, they did not argue. They counted the jars, parceled the meat, and watched colour return to the children's faces. Even their silence carried a scent. A fortnight later, the Count came clothed like a captain of a lost age, braid at his cuffs, a cold star pinned to his breast. He spoke of thresholds then, what should and should not cross them. Hang the doorways with woven twigs and straw. Leave the holy parchments rolled and bound. Speak no name for 3 nights. The priest woke with his mouth aching, as if he had bitten it in his sleep. He gave the guidance as if it were his own prudence. The village obeyed as if it were theirs, and the wind dropped to a whisper that did not find a way through any seam. Rewards followed each obedience. A fever broke in a child who had given up coughing only to sleep too still. The well that had begun to taste of iron ran clean. A crate of coal, all but buried at the back of a shed no one remembered, was found when a boy chased a cat into the dark. The line between cause and boon thinned to a single hair he could not resist tracing. Then, at last, the Count spoke in the voice of a judge. He stood in a hall whose walls were a forest of polished spears, every blade catching a light that had no source. He looked, for once, unadorned. No ring, no braid, no fur. Only that face like a coin rubbed thin with use, and the eyes that held his without blinking. Collect them, he said. All of them. Every symbol you keep as a promise to a god who does not come. Melt them to slag. The demonic undertone crawled up through the syllables and set the hairs on the priest's arms on end. He could not mistake the nature of it. He could not pretend ignorance of what was being asked. He woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth and sat until the stove went from red to ashen. He waited for outrage to rise, for certainty to return. None did. Morning came blue and brittle. He wrapped the infant, handed the child off to the widow who now took turns sleeping by his stove, and went to find the elders. They were startled when he spoke. Their shock flickered over their faces and was gone. One of them, a man who had been at his side for weddings and funerals for 30 years, opened his mouth and shut it again. Another, whose daughter had been the woman with the baby, stared at his hands as if they might supply an answer better than his tongue. Finally, the oldest of them said, very quietly, "A single brass cross will not feed a child." "It is not about the metal," the priest said, surprised at his own evenness. "It is about what we cling to when our hands are empty." They knew, each of them, what source he had not named. None spoke it. The anger they nurtured for the church, hard, old, and righteous, did the rest of the work. If he wanted them, he would have sent bread, someone muttered. There was a nodding that was not agreement so much as an exhaustion that had chosen its road. By dusk, a line had formed outside the smithy. The air was still, the cold held at arm's length by the heat pouring from the open door. One by one, villagers came with their burdens. There were small wooden crosses, larger brass ones from mantelpieces, a bent reliquary box with nothing left inside, a handful of medals from throats that had been thin for too long, a rosary whose beads had been rubbed smooth by fingers that were now calloused from work. Someone brought the clapper from the chapel bell, wrapped in a rag like contraband. Another, after a long pause in the dark doorway, held out a gilded icon that had never hung straight in the damp house and now would never hang again. The priest stood beside the smith. He had thought there would be resistance, bargaining, tears. Instead, there was a quiet like the pause between a question and its echo. He wanted to tell them to stop. He wanted to tell them to go home and set the crosses back above the beds where children shivered. Then a girl ran past the door, cheeks ruddy, a heel of bread in her fist, laughing because a dog leapt at the crust and missed. The priest closed his mouth. The smith fed the forge. Coal roared. The crucible glowed, then brightened toward white. Metal hissed as it went in. First the small things, making a sound like rain on a hot stone. Then the larger ones that needed the tongs. The smell that rose was not incense and not simple heat. It was something sweet, edged with the bite of old oil, a scent that tinged the tongue. Faces leaned into the warmth and flinched from it in the same breath. Someone began to hum. No hymn, only a low, tuneless thing, the sound of endurance made into sound. Others took it up. The priest did not sing. He watched the metal surface tremble and smooth again, until the shapes inside were no longer discernible. Meaning turned liquid. "Pour," he said at last, and his voice did not shake. They tipped the crucible. The stream went into a mold the smith had hastily cobbled from sand and scrap. It filled, steaming. When it cooled enough to hold a skin, the smith pressed a rough brand into it. Not a mark of any infernal house or saint. Only a circle with a line through it, a sign for null, for the thing that used to be something and now was not. They set the ingot in the snow to seize the last heat. The hiss of it sounded like a whisper of assent. No miracle came in that instant. The sky did not clear. No choir sang. The world remained itself, cold, demanding, hungry. And yet, when the wind shifted a little later, it came from the south, soft with the faintest scent of thaw far away. The infant at the widow's hearth slept without starting for the first time in nights. The well did not freeze over again before morning. He did not congratulate himself. He did not defend what he had done to any invisible judge. He simply stood in the doorway of the smithy with his palms open to the heat and watched the faces of his people in the glow, the lines in them eased by grease and soup, the way their shoulders settled when they believed they had bought one day more. Surprise at their willingness fluttered in him and went out like a candle in a draught. He understood. The children had color in their cheeks again. Understanding was simpler than piety. Later, when the line had thinned and the coals had gone from raw to murmur, he took the ingot up in both hands. It was heavier than its size warranted. He wrapped it in burlap, as they had wrapped the goat, and carried it to the edge of the trees. He set it down on the snow like an offering and spoke no words. The forest stood silent. Somewhere far within, a branch cracked like a knuckle. He felt eyes on him, dream eyes caught eyes, and did not turn to meet them. "Keep them breathing," he said, his voice hardly more than fog in the cold. And this time it was not a prayer, not exactly. It was a condition. The wind stirred the pines. The hamlet's chimney smoked. He went back to bank the stove for the widow and her child, and to mark, without ceremony, the line he had crossed and the road that lay on the other side. That night, the Count returned once more to the priest's dreams. The air of easy courtliness he had worn before seemed thinner now, like a mask stretched too tight over something hungrier. He appeared seated in a high-backed chair, carved with symbols the priest could not read, the edges glistening as though wet with oil. His smile was sharp and fixed, but when he spoke it cracked into something deeper, a voice that resonated with a demonic undertone. "You have served me well," he said. "The offerings, the obedience, the breaking of false icons. You have fulfilled your end, and I have fulfilled mine." His gloved hand made a small gesture, and visions spilled forth unbidden. The villagers laughing as they dragged deer from the forest, children sleeping with bellies full, the glow of hearths that had gone cold, rekindled with warmth. But petty rituals and scraps are only the beginning. To gain the patronage of a true noble of hell requires more. The priest's breath caught in his throat. He tried to cry out, to deny what he already felt pressing towards him, but his voice would not form. The Count rose, and as he did, the dreamscape shuddered. The air thickened. An aura pressed in around the priest, compressing his chest, suffocating him. His knees buckled beneath the weight of it. "You will serve me not as a supplicant, but as a priest," the Count said, his words heavy as chains. "You spent a life shackled to a god who never answered you, who turned his face from this land. Was it so difficult to cast off his name? You did not fight it long. You did not even weep when you fed the crosses to the fire. You only obeyed. You only chose survival." The Count's eyes blazed, a light that was not light at all, but something that seemed to burn through flesh, to touch marrow. "You were ready, so ready to be freed. Why not pledge yourself to one who is real, one who rewards his followers?" The priest trembled, both in terror and in some darker recognition. Inwardly, he reflected on how swiftly his surrender had come, how easily he had guided his people to acts he would once have condemned. He had not fought long against despair. He had not clung to doctrine as a drowning man clings to driftwood. Perhaps the Count was right. Perhaps foul magics had eased his path. Or perhaps his faith had been a brittle thing all along, waiting only for a winter such as this to break it. The Count's lips curled in a smile that was both amused and cruel. "You suspect sorcery, that I tilted your heart with whispers, softened your will with unseen hands. And perhaps I did. But what does it matter? Do you not see the children thriving? Do you not see the bellies full and fires burning? If the method is foul, the outcome is still life." His voice deepened, resonant now with a choir of echoes. "And is that not what you prayed for all your years? That your flock might live?" The priest's throat convulsed, but he could not reply. The Count's power clamped down, forcing silence upon him. Instead, his thoughts were pulled like pages through a hand. Memory after memory of obedience, of survival, of small concessions that together became a road. Each step had seemed reasonable at the time. Each had been for the children, for the widows, for the village. And yet, taken together, they spelled out a word that was no longer God's. As if savoring his helplessness, the Count shifted the dream once more. The walls around them bled away, and in their place appeared the village. He saw the houses standing quiet under snow. He saw the church, stripped bare, its doors shuttered. He saw the people, their faces lean but alive, their eyes less hollow than they had been. For a moment, he almost felt relief. Then the vision fractured. The same village torched, soldiers in the church's livery cutting down the weak and the old, screams rising as homes burned. Another vision. The same village lying silent under snowdrifts, the people starved, their bodies stiff and curled where they had fallen. Another still. The forest spilling inward, monstrous shapes tearing through doors, the Count's own kin feasting in red slaughter. Back and forth the dream spun, between life and death, between salvation and ruin. The Count's voice spoke over it all. "You have my interest, but a demon's interest is fleeting. Only those who prove themselves worthy endure it, fail, and you will be swept away like ash in a storm." Finally, the vision ceased. The priest found himself once more in the dark, kneeling on a floor that had no substance. His chest heaved as though he had been running, though no breath filled his lungs. Above him, the Count's figure loomed, immense and terrible now, a silhouette against a horizon that burned with no sun. "You know what must come next," the Count whispered. "You will not sleep easy until you choose." The dream released him at last, casting him back into his narrow bed. He woke with sweat freezing on his brow, the infant stirring faintly at the hearth. Yet though the room was silent, though the fire still smouldered low, he knew the Count's eyes lingered, watching, waiting, demanding. For several nights after, the Count did not return. The priest almost wished he had, for in the Count's absence there was no relief, only visions, repeating and unrelenting. His sleep became a torment of shifting images. Again and again he saw the village destroyed, flames devouring thatched roofs, snow drifts covering lifeless bodies, shadowy forms tearing through the lanes. But just as often, the visions twisted and changed, showing the opposite. The villagers alive, their cheeks flushed with health, their children chasing each other through the square. Yet in these scenes of survival, everything was wrong. Crosses were gone, replaced by symbols etched in black iron that hurt the eyes to look upon. The villagers' faces, once marked by humility and simple kindness, were hardened, their grins wide and sharp, their laughter edged with cruelty. Totems of bone and twisted wood stood in the lanes, leering with grotesque features. And always there was the sound of chanting, deep and unceasing, rising and falling like the pulse of a monstrous heart. They praised the Count in tones that made his bones ache, their joy a thing that stank of madness. These visions began to bleed into his waking hours. Sometimes, when he stood alone in the chapel or walked the lanes of the village, his attention would drift, and in the hush of the wind he would hear it, that same monotone chant, echoing faintly as though from beneath the earth. He would shake his head, murmur prayers he no longer fully believed, and the sound would fade, but it always returned. At first he told himself it was merely weariness, the burden of long months of hardship pressing down upon him. Yet he knew, in the hidden parts of his heart, that the Count's hand was in it. The visions were not random. They were shaping him, bending him toward inevitability. Each night he fought them. Each night he told himself he would not surrender. Then, after days of this torment, his choice was stolen from him. It was late, and the snow outside lay heavy across the roofs, muffling every sound. A knock came at his door, startling him from uneasy half-sleep. He rose and opened it to find the elders of the village standing there, their faces drawn and weary but lit by a kind of resolve. They entered quietly, as though bearing a body, and sat with him by the dim light of the hearth. They spoke not of crops, nor of supplies, nor even of the children, but of him. They told him they saw the strain in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under invisible weight. They spoke of how he had carried their burdens, how he had led them through storms and famine where other villages had withered and died. They saw that he was haunted, they said, and they wished to ease his torment. He tried to dismiss their words, to speak of duty, but they pressed on. With care and concern, they told him that they had placed their trust in him, and that trust had been repaid with survival. Then, with words that shook him more than any vision, they confessed what he had not expected to hear. They had long since lost hope in the God who had abandoned them. The admission cut him. These were people who once prayed with clear eyes and earnest hearts. Yet now they looked at him with steady conviction, saying that they wished to serve the new patron he had found. At their words, he could hear it, faint and mocking, the Count's laughter echoing somewhere in his skull. The elders spoke of their fear, that the gifts already granted could be withdrawn, that their children might yet starve if they did not continue in obedience. They spoke of their resolve, that survival was worth any sacrifice, even their very souls. And finally they spoke of their desire to pledge themselves wholly and without hesitation to the Count. The old man's heart broke. For all his life he had sought only to shepherd them, to guide them toward the light of salvation. Now they stood before him, ready to kneel at the feet of a demon. He wanted to shout, to weep, to forbid them, but he could not. He looked into their eyes and saw no wavering. He saw only a grim strength born of hunger and fear, the strength of people who had endured too much. His last defenses crumbled. He thought of the infant who slept by his hearth. He thought of the children in the schoolroom, their eyes alight with trust in him. He thought of the women who had buried husbands, of the men who had buried sons. If damnation was the price for their survival, then he would pay it. At last he lowered his head, his voice breaking as he whispered, "For you, my children. For you, my flock. I will sacrifice even this." And somewhere in the silence that followed, he felt the Count's gaze settle upon him, heavy and triumphant, as though a hand had closed around his soul. That night, the Count returned. The dream began as they often did, with the world dissolving into a pale void where sky and earth could not be told apart. There was no wind, no sound, only stillness. The Count stood before him, tall and terrible, his form shifting as though reality itself resisted holding him. Horns curled, then straightened. His garments rippled between noble silks and ragged hide. His eyes, however, never changed. Black wells that devoured light. He said nothing. He did not need to. The old priest fell to his knees. His lips trembled as he whispered words he never thought he would say, words he had once sworn to cast into the pit of blasphemy. "I surrender. My soul is yours." At once he felt it. Chains, unseen but terribly real, coiled around him. They dug deep, not into flesh, but into the marrow of his spirit. They pierced thought, memory, faith. He gasped as they tightened, pulling him down and yet lifting him up, binding him utterly. He was shackled, claimed, owned. And in that moment, he knew he could never undo what had been done. The Count's smile widened, a grotesque mirror of triumph. With a gesture like the drawing back of a curtain, knowledge poured into the old man's mind. It came not as a gentle stream, but as a flood that battered and tore at him. He reeled under it, clutching his head, laughing and crying all at once as his thoughts were drowned. He saw the Count for what he truly was. Not the vague figure of his earlier dreams, but a lord of hell revealed in dreadful majesty. He saw the weight of centuries of sin piled upon his name. Cities burned in his honor. Blood spilled on altars carved with his sigils. Songs sung in his praise by voices that had long since rotted in graves. He saw the vast legions under his command, legions of things that were not human, that had never been human, yet wore human shapes like mockery. He beheld courts where every act was cruelty sharpened into art, every moment of agony prolonged for eternity. More visions pressed in, each more vile than the last. Forbidden tongues etched themselves into his memory, sounds that felt like hot irons against the mind. He knew them instantly for what they were, the language of hell. He understood the syllables that demons spat in their blasphemous litanies, the words that bent a reality and unmade holiness. Rituals unspooled themselves before his inner eye. How to cut flesh so that it yielded the richest offering. How to arrange bone so that it sang in resonance with infernal powers. How to whisper prayers that twisted mercy into power. He should have screamed. He should have recoiled. But he did neither. For he had opened the doors of his soul wide, and the Count entered freely. Resistance was no longer possible, and worse, no longer desired. The knowledge poured in, saturating him, transforming him. It rewrote what he had once thought sacred, breaking down the old scaffolding of faith and building something blacker, heavier, and more enduring in its place. And through it all, he laughed. It began as a thin, frightened chuckle, but it grew until it echoed across the void, ragged and wild. He laughed as he beheld his own corruption, laughed as the prayers he once cherished were replaced with new blasphemous verses. He laughed as the faces of the villagers flashed before him, not in innocence, but painted with ash and blood, chanting the Count's name. He laughed because madness was the only way to withstand the torrent that poured through him. The Count did not laugh with him. He only watched, eyes dark and devouring, his grin sharp and satisfied. When the torrent of knowledge at last slowed, the priest, no longer truly a priest, collapsed to the ground. His chest heaved, his body trembling. He was not the man who had knelt minutes before. He was something else now, bound and branded. He could feel the chain still tightening, not to restrain him, but to shape him, to twist him further, until he was remade in the Count's image. In the silence that followed, his laughter dwindled to ragged breaths. He lay there, face pressed to the ground, tears streaking his cheeks. And when he dared to raise his eyes, he no longer looked upon the Count with fear, but with a grotesque reverence. "Teach me," he whispered hoarsely. "Make me yours." The Count inclined his head, as though acknowledging a student's oath. Then he vanished, leaving the old man alone in the void, clutching his chains, his mind echoing with prayers no god of heaven would ever hear. The priest awoke at dawn, his body trembling from the night's ordeal. For a long while he lay still, staring at the cracked beams of his ceiling, unwilling to move, unwilling even to breathe. He felt a strange heat radiating from his brow, a pulse that throbbed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Rising unsteadily, he stumbled to the basin and peered into the murky water. His reflection stared back at him with sunken eyes, but above them was something new. A mark, raw and seared into the flesh of his forehead. The Count's sigil, branded like livestock. He should have recoiled. He should have wept. Instead, he simply pulled his hood low and accepted it. The brand did not feel like a wound. It felt like a seal, a crown. He touched it once, briefly, and a spark of dark warmth ran through his hand. There was no need for fear anymore. He belonged. For the first time in many weeks, he reached for the rope that hung from the chapel's rafters. With a strength that belied his age, he pulled, and the bell tolled across the frosted village. The clean, bright chime struck his ears like shards of glass. He hissed through his teeth, loathing the sound. Yet he kept ringing until the villagers stirred from their hovels and trudged toward the chapel, drawn by habit older than despair. They came hesitantly. They came with wary eyes. Some carried their children, thin and pale, wrapped in patched furs. They filled the benches, murmuring among themselves, uneasy with the sudden call. When the old man stepped forth from the shadows of the altar, hood pulled low, they fell silent. He did not speak the prayers of old. Words poured from his mouth, but they were not his own. They slithered from his lips in syllables that carried the sting of fire and ash, a language not meant for human tongues. He had no memory of learning them, yet they came easily, gliding with sinister beauty. Each word left him tingling. Each phrase seemed to bleed into the air, seeping into the cracks of the chapel like smoke. The villagers listened. At first they frowned in confusion, for they could not understand the words. But then they felt them. A weight pressed into their chests. A fire kindled in their veins. They shifted uneasily, muttered, and then their mutters turned to wild cries. Their eyes glimmered with a feral light, their voices breaking into chants that echoed the priest's blasphemous sermon. He spoke of strength, of sacrifice, of survival not through prayer to a God who had abandoned them, but through devotion to one who rewarded faith with tangible gifts. His voice, once soft and grandfatherly, thundered now with command. He felt the corruption the Count had poured into him sear outward, flowing like black water, soaking into the villagers. Their faces, which once had been weary and hollow, twisted into expressions of manic fervor. They were becoming something new, something other. And though some faint corner of his soul whispered shame, it was barely a whisper at all. Already, he no longer looked upon them as children of God entrusted to his care. He saw them as clay, malleable, crude, to be shaped into weapons, into tools, into an offering. Yet not all bowed. In the sea of uplifted hands and shouting throats, one man stood stiff, his face twisted in revulsion. He did not chant. His lips did not move. His eyes darted around in horror as his neighbors fell into rapture. The priest's gaze fell upon him, and in that moment he saw it, the glint of light against metal, a cross, small and humble, hanging from a cord at the man's throat. The sight struck him like a brand pressed to flesh. Rage boiled through him, rage not entirely his own, but magnified by the Count's mark upon his brow. How dare this man cling to a false god in the face of revelation? How dare he resist when all others embrace the gift? His voice, low and crackling with fire, lashed out across the chapel. Seize him. The crowd turned. Eyes wild, faces snarling, they fell upon the man. He cried out, pushing, fighting, but the frenzy of the mob was unstoppable. Rough hands dragged him forward through the aisle toward the altar. The chapel, once a place of peace, rang with shrieks and sobs and guttural laughter. They forced him down, pinning him to the floor as others hastily cleared a table and draped it with a stained cloth, a makeshift altar. The man thrashed and pleaded, eyes locking on the priest. "Father, please, you baptize me, you—" The words fell on deaf ears. Somewhere in the haze of madness, the priest remembered him. A boy who had once stayed after Mass to help sweep the pews. A young man who had worked tirelessly to gather the harvest, who had fed neighbors before himself. A man who had carried the coffins of the old and built homes for the newlyweds. A good man, a faithful man. But those memories slid away like water over stone. The priest's hand moved to his side, and there it was, a blade of black iron, jagged and hungry. He did not know from where it had come. Perhaps it had always been there waiting. He raised it high, its weight filling him with a terrible hunger of his own. His lips moved again, chanting words in the broken tongue of hell. Each syllable burned his throat, yet he revelled in the pain. He lowered the blade. The man's scream was swallowed by the roar of the congregation, by their chants, by their howls. Blood splattered across the altar, across the priest's hands, across the villagers' faces. And above it all, he heard it, the Count's laughter, deep and delighted, echoing through his skull. When at last the knife withdrew, when the body lay still, the priest raised his dripping hands and cried out in triumph. The villagers roared with him, their souls sealed in that moment, their devotion cemented not in prayer, but in blood. Thus the baptism was complete. The chapel, once holy ground, was desecrated. No longer did it belong to God. It belonged to the Count. The priest looked upon the frenzied flock and felt no pity, no regret. They were his now, not his children, not his brothers, but his instruments. Their souls were bound with his, dragged down the same path into darkness. And with their first sacrifice, the village was remade. The Count's work had truly begun. Beyond the skeletal tree line of the forest lay a battlefield that had long since devoured hope. The land itself was a wound, scarred, cratered, and drowned in mud. No man's land stretched in both directions, a desolation of shattered barbed wire and the rotting husks of old fortifications. Corpses lay buried half seen in the mire, their faces peeled back by the rains and their fingers frozen in grasping claws. The dull roar of artillery never ceased, punctuated by the crack of rifles and the staccato of machine guns that sputtered and died, only to bark again minutes later. The ground shook like the skin of a fevered beast. On one side of the trenches, the faithful held their lines with the grim tenacity of men who had known nothing but exhaustion. Their chaplains walked the narrow duckboards, voices hoarse from shouting scripture and prayers into the storm of battle. They exhorted the men to serve God's will, to hold firm against the abyss. Faces, dirt-smeared and haggard, turned upward with the stubborn gleam of faith, though their bodies shook with fatigue. Their uniforms were ragged, their boots soaked through. Yet they stayed. They endured. It was into this fragile persistence that something new came. From the forest behind them, figures emerged, cloaked and hooded against the biting wind. The sentries on the rear line blinked in confusion, lowering their rifles slightly. There had been no word of pilgrim war bands passing this way, no expected reinforcements. The shadows moved closer, the shapes resolving into villagers, their steps steady, their movements deliberate. The sentries exchanged uneasy glances. "Hold," one of them called out. "Who goes there?" The villagers gave no answer. They simply kept walking, their hoods pulled low. It was only when the distance between them shrank to a dozen paces that the sentries saw the stains. Fresh blood smeared their robes, thick lines running down from their scalps, where infernal runes had been carved into flesh. Faces twisted with manic joy stared out from beneath their hoods. One of the faithful drew breath to cry warning, but the report of a hunting rifle cracked first. The man fell, his chest a ruin. The others followed swiftly, some cut down by rough iron blades hammered in village forges, others by gunfire that echoed strangely cheerful in the morning air. Then the villagers broke into a run, and the trenches screamed. They poured over the rear like a tide of feral animals, snarling, shrieking, their eyes lit with unnatural fire. The faithful, exhausted, unprepared for assault from behind, turned with disbelief etched onto their faces. Some reached for their rifles, only to have their throats opened by cleavers once used to carve meat. Others raised rough bayonets and met a howling rush that did not falter, even when steel sank deep into flesh. Villagers fought like men possessed, heedless of pain, heedless of death. The trench devolved into chaos. Rifle fire erupted wild, frantic, men shooting into the bodies of former neighbors, only to be dragged down by others whose mouths foamed with zeal. Grenades tumbled into the mud, blasting limbs into the frozen walls. The stench of blood and powder mingled with the old rot of the battlefield until it was impossible to tell one from the other. And through it all, one voice rose clear above the din. The priest stood upon the rim of the trench, robes whipping in the winter wind, the count's mark burning upon his brow. His arms were spread wide as he cried praises in a tongue the faithful did not understand, but which struck their ears like poison. Each syllable rang with authority, with command, and it stirred his flock to greater frenzy. Where they stumbled, his voice lifted them. Where they faltered, his words ignited them with fresh bloodlust. "Blood for the Count," he roared, his throat raw, his voice carried by something greater than lungs or flesh. "Blood for the one who rewards devotion." The villagers echoed him, their chants blending with the dying screams of the faithful soldiers. Their crude blades rose and fell in rhythm with his words. Their bullets tore through men already too weary to raise their rifles. They ripped apart the faithful line from the rear, turning it into a slaughter. Some chaplains tried to rally resistance, crying scripture with all the strength their lungs could summon. For moments it seemed to work. Men drew close around them, bayonets flashing. But the mob was too many, too wild, and behind them the priest's voice hammered their resolve into dust. One chaplain fell with his skull split by a shovel. Another strangled with barbed wire that the villagers had dragged in coils from the dead ground. The trench was consumed. Fire spread as lanterns were kicked over in the struggle, flames licking the frozen planks. Wounded men wailed, crawling through mud only to be crushed underfoot. In the chaos, a single prayer rose, carried by a boy not yet of the age of 20. He screamed for deliverance even as a blade found his gut, his words choked in blood. The villagers laughed at the sound, their howls rolling over the trench like a storm. The priest's eyes shone as he looked down on the carnage. He no longer saw faces, not of the faithful, not of the villagers. They were no longer individuals to him, but pieces in a vast design, sacrifices for his master, proof that the Count's promises bore fruit. He raised his black iron dagger high, its jagged edge wet with the blood of the morning slaughter. "This is the proof," he bellowed, his voice ragged with ecstasy. The God you served has abandoned you, but the Count answers. In blood we find strength. In sacrifice, survival. The villagers shrieked their agreement. They had been remade. Not farmers, not hunters, not weary peasants, but heretics baptized in violence, bound forever to the will of hell. As the trench burned, and the cries of the dying were swallowed by smoke and flame, the priest smiled. The front lines were endless, the war eternal. But here, in this place, his Count had claimed victory, and this was only the beginning.